Okay.
Hebben jullie nou beeld?
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. Hopefully you had a very nice and inspiring lunch. I think so, because our morning session was extremely inspiring, so hopefully you had the time to digest and to discuss all the things we discussed about this morning. Great you're here again for the afternoon part of Searching for the New Luxury. I'll be the moderator of this afternoon session. My name is Farid Tubarki. I'm a zeitgeist researcher. I try to see what's currently happening, what it means for our future organizations, our future systems, if we want to transform our societies. And that's also actually the theme of today and tomorrow. So I'm thrilled to be part of this exploration, this search for the new luxury. And in this morning, we already tried to search for the new luxury. José presented State of Fashion, which will be opening. We have the privilege of attending the opening at 5:30 here in Arnhem with the Minister of Education, Culture and Art. And she explained and discussed what this exhibition is about. What are the values, searching for the right values, the materials, the human values behind the new luxury. And then Danielle shared with us her research experience and her agenda for the coming time about how can research be impactful and try to have the right answers or the right questions to search for the new luxury. And then Pascal gave her keynote about what does it mean for education. How can you build up a master, the philosophy behind a master here in Arnhem, which tries to already ground this new thinking about the new luxury. So I think we had a great plenary session here in the morning, and then we went out in different breakouts to discuss all these different features in smaller groups, and we were part of the discussion. Here on stage, we have 2 hours, 2 blocks of 1 hour, where we have some more keynote speakers, and also a panel where we're going to deepen further into this thinking. How can we do it? What can we do? And what are the organizing principles behind the new luxury? And it's nice because Pascal mentioned that the master is fashion held in common, and our first speaker of today is a guru or an expert on commons. He is an activist, an author of a very important book, Think Like a Commoner, which has been translated in many, many languages and also is therefore very impactful on the theory of the commons, the philosophy of the commons, and the practice of the commons. So it's great to see how this philosophy of commons, what can it mean for fashion and for the system behind the fashion. So please give him a very warm welcome, our first keynote speaker, David Bollier. There he is.
Well, I want to thank the organizers, especially Daniela, for inviting me here. It's really a privilege to talk to some people who are trying to develop some socially minded alternatives in fashion. I hope to introduce the idea of the commons, the idea of enclosures, and then talk about how it is a strategic alternative and some ways, some suggestions for how it might be applied in the fashion world. Let me just figure this out. So I'm going to try to reimagine fashion as an ecosystem of commons. And we should start with the idea that we have to get beyond the tragedy of the commons idea, which is the first thing that comes to many people's mind, that if you have a commons, it inevitably will be a tragedy, meaning the overuse of the resource. This was started by Garrett Hardin, a biologist in 1968, who wrote a famous essay called The Tragedy of the Commons. He said, imagine you have a pasture in which anybody can graze as many cattle as they want on it. It will inevitably be overused and ruined, resulting in a tragedy. Well, this idea was eventually rebutted through the life work of, well, let me just first say how there's a lot of embedded assumptions about this. The idea of the tragedy is really the tragedy of the unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resource with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. I mean, those are the built-in premises of the whole tragedy parable. But in fact, as Eleanor Ostrom, a political scientist at Indiana University, described in her life work, empirically people self-organize, they coordinate, they communicate, they negotiate to find ways to sustainably manage their shared resources. Her book, Governing the Commons, in 1990 was the landmark for which she won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And that's a significant date because it was the year after the financial crisis. And my hunch was the Nobel Prize Committee wanted someone a little bit different than the standard economics person. And she had studied how cooperation is a consequential aspect of managing resources, something that standard economists mostly ignore. She has a global network of scholars that she helped establish who now study the commons as a scholarly endeavor. But it's important to realize that a commons is not simply an unowned resource, the way the economists often talk about it, like space or the oceans or the internet. It's a self-organized social system. So it's a community, the resource, and then the social protocols and rituals and traditions and practices that we develop to manage the resource. This is an important distinction between the way most people think of the commons and the way we need to think about it. Now, talking about the commons has an important advantage because we can talk about the idea of enclosure, which is an idea that otherwise doesn't really exist in our political culture. Enclosure is about essentially global capital and businesses taking over the resources and disbanding the community that's managed it. And there's a whole history, especially in English history, but also in European history and in colonization, of taking over the commons, enclosing the commons. Because, frankly, investors like the fact that the resources are free, cheap, easy to seize without having to pay for them. Now, enclosure can be understood as the privatization and the commodification of these shared resources. And it's also a supreme act of dispossession because it's taking away the people's culture and identity and sense of meaning in managing their shared resources. And the resource is simply taken for its market value, and so it's ripped from its organic context. So commons have a certain local rootedness and situatedness in a larger context. It's not simply an economic resource. And the really unacknowledged problem, the unacknowledged scandal of our times is the enclosures going on right now. Currently, there's an international land grab which is taking lands in Latin America, Asia, Africa, often in collusion with national governments, to essentially take from indigenous peoples and subsistence commoners the lands they've used for generations, often eliminating the innovations that they had done and the sustainability that they had used in managing their wealth, forests, fisheries, irrigation water, and so forth. Another enclosure of our time is the human genome. 20% of the human genome is now privately patented, which I find ethically outrageous. It also means that certain researchers don't want to research in certain areas because they might infringe upon the patent. So, for example, the breast cancer susceptibility gene is kind of off limits, or people are wary of doing research there because there's a patent for that. And I could go on quite long about the number of other market enclosures going on, but they all share much of the same dynamic of marketizing something that was used as a shared resource, usually in non-market ways. Now, enclosure also has social meanings, because it moves people from enduring social relationships to short, impersonal transactions. So it becomes a transactional relationship instead of something longer. And it moves from ideas of the commonweal for the community to how can we stimulate private consumption. And it moves us from a society of gift and duty. I received gifts from others and from my ancestors, and I have a duty to pass them forward. It moves from that ethic of society to you're on your own in the cash economy. And so this is really a kind of significant change. And in trying to communicate this, I often wondered, how can the inner dimensions of enclosure be made clear? Well, this is a map of the Great Sandy Desert in Australia, as seen by Western moderns, where it's a very utilitarian, functional approach. But if you want to see how the indigenous people look at it, it's like this. It's like a work of art, because they have affective relationships over time with the landscape. And so it's a very rich, emotional, even spiritual relationship that is often wiped out when you have enclosure, when the cash economy, when capitalism is the dominating matrix for how you're motivated. Pascal, of course, referred to some of this morning. So let me talk briefly about the commons as a strategic alternative. The commons is a universe of value, not just economic value, but about fairness in how people collectively manage the resource. It's about having responsibilities for being a steward of those resources, as well as having entitlements for that kind of responsibility. A key idea is inalienability. This is not for sale in the market, or only under strictly regulated terms by the way we want to, we the commoners. So the commons is not necessarily against markets, but it wants to have a more mindful relationship with how it engages with the market. And it's about bottom-up rulemaking. It's about long-term stewardship. It's about meeting basic needs first, as opposed to just catering to consumer wants and where the money is to buy. The really kind of remarkable thing is that there's an estimated 2 billion people around the world who to this day depend upon natural resource commons like fisheries and forests and water, wild game, pastures for their everyday subsistence. But because this is not a market economy, economists don't really regard this as too interesting or significant. There's no cash being exchanged. But it's arguably a more benign form of meeting needs and protecting the earth. And this is not just in faraway places. There's a lot of local food sovereignty movement, as I'm sure you're aware, both in Europe and the United States and other places, where there's a lot of innovations trying to bring these principles to within the heart of industrial agriculture and big business. There's a whole city as a commons movement, especially here in Europe, places like Amsterdam, Barcelona, Seoul, Korea, Bologna, Italy, where the commons is being used as a framework or template for rethinking how city policy should occur. You know, should absentee investors and wealthy people be dictating the policy directions of a city and how it's used? And these are some of the examples of how commoning principles are being applied. There's a lot of alternative currencies movement that is trying to capture the value of communities for those communities instead of having the banks or other financial players basically appropriate and extract value from communities. So again, the commons is about taking control of the resources that belong to us. The web is a fascinating infrastructure that I think is perfectly disposed to help create commons. It's more, the Facebooks and Twitters and the companies get more attention, but it is a very low barrier to access for people creating their own commons on the web. And I think this has led to a vast explosion of all sorts of creativity, precisely because it's commoning and not market-driven. Creative Commons licenses are an important legal tool and infrastructure for helping move this along, because it takes copyright law and turns it inside out into copyleft, so that you can, in advance, say this is under a CC license, and it's shareable without payment or permission in advance. So it radically turns around the property presumptions of copyright law to make things shareable. There's now, as I say, more than 170 legal jurisdictions in which the licenses are used, more than 1 billion documents and creative works that are licensed under it. So it's created a vast shareability resource pool of shareable content. Of course, the whole open source software explosion, from Linux, open access journals for scholarship, LibreOffice, there's quite a few things going on there which has revolutionized software and in turn a lot of real life. But there's also now oops, I guess it's another slide. There's a whole open hardware and design world that is building on the same principles of open source, which I'll get back to in a minute. The point of all this is that commenting is generative, it's not a tragedy, and it's creating value, albeit it's not always monetized value, but it's creating useful things that meet needs in a real way. So it's not a tragedy. Peer governance and provisioning are some of the chief attributes of what a commons does, which helps us get beyond the straitjacket of business models and bureaucracy, which are often seen as the only ways to get things done. Commoning is another way to do things. And also significantly, it's practice-driven and not ideological. Does it work? Does it meet needs? As opposed to, I'm anti-capitalist, and therefore you should do this. So it has a different basis. Now, I tried to imagine how some commons principles might apply in the fashion world, and what follows are a handful of suggestions that distill some of the lessons I've learned in a cross-sectoral self-education about commons, and in which there's certain recurrent patterns. So I wanted to share with you some ideas, which I might add are not blueprints, because any commons or commoners have to do this themselves. They have to adapt them to their local circumstances. But I'm hoping that they'll be suggestive and that maybe we can talk about it further in the panel. Let me start by saying artists and designers understand the commons because I think they can, part of their identity is to imagine new possibilities and to do it from speaking from the human heart, which is a different place than if you're just trying to cater to the market. And all art is ultimately collaborative, if only with the prior generations of artists. So there's a natural predisposition, I think, of artists and commons that is something we should be thinking about and play with. In 2005, I was involved in a conference called Ready to Share, Fashion and the Ownership of Creativity. And the point was, fashion is an open source community. The cultural norms and social practices of open source are what's going on in fashion, because you can't own a herringbone suit design or a peasant dress or any other number of standard items of wear. It's the trademark you can own, the brand identity. And this has made, I think, fashion extremely creative, because we're constantly borrowing from each other and being inspired by each other without proprietary controls or market controls getting in the way of it. But the point is, can fashion break free of capital and some of its demands for how the creativity should evolve? Can we break free of some of the cultural identities that the fashion world is trying to impose on us for its own market purposes? And I think that's really kind of the challenge we need to try to explore. And I'd like to think we can do this by reimagining fashion as an ecosystem of commons. None of them all the same, but serving different functions and roles. But this, of course, raises the question, how do we start to build such a thing? So these are my suggestions. One is we have to first start to beat the bounds to resist market enclosures. There was a tradition in medieval commons of every year the commoners walking the perimeter of their village. And if anybody had erected a fence or a hedge to enclose the commons for private purposes, they would knock it down. And this was a big community party. It helped reaffirm their identity as commoners. This is, I think, what we need to reinvent in modern times. What is our shared wealth and how can we protect it? We need to beat the bounds and find ways to do it. The Creative Commons licenses and the general public license for software, for example, are ways to do that using legal licenses. But there's other ways. There's social norms, there's technology for protecting the shared wealth. I like to focus on what I call the triad of commoning, which is social life, peer governance, and provisioning, which are three interconnected aspects of the way commoning occurs. I might add, commons is a verb and not just a noun. It's the practice of these things that matters, not just invoking the term commons. And I think we need to, in turn, build new types of collaborative institutions. Things like platform cooperatives, which are alternatives to Airbnb and Uber, ways to mutualize the benefit of the platforms. And commons-based trust, where a trust will hold something as a steward for everyone else. Or digital commons, mutual aid networks. There's a lot of innovation going on in digital spaces for new ways to organize beyond the simple business or nonprofit model. And a key part of this is practical experimentation, not ideology. Again, it's sort of building the relationships and social practice to make this work. And the monetized value, which often inevitably gets sucked into catering to the market, is not the key point. One still needs to find ways to finance things, one still needs revenue, but one needs to be conscious about how one interacts with the market. And as Peter Linebaugh, this historian of the commons, has put it, there is no commons without commoning. So these practices of developing a shared identity and commitments and mission through meetings and rituals and celebrations and many other things, I consider the essence of commoning. But part of it also, we need to engage with existing infrastructures and finance systems, and we have to invent our own. I think one reason the local food movement, or say Linux as an operating system on computers worked, is they basically withdrew from the prevailing market and said, we're going to create our own parallel economy on our terms, and we'll talk later with the market about how this might work. They were essentially creating their own infrastructure and finance, and I think that is the way that we're going to get empowered, distributed commons that are not simply consolidated. And it's the way you can start to de-commodify production and distribution so that you're provisioning for need and not catering to affluent wants only. It's a way of sharing benefits, and I'll talk in a moment about emulate and federating being the way to scale this, because it's key to try to have the diversification of power and innovation instead of one consolidated form. Well, here's the slide I was thinking of earlier. There's a whole movement called cosmo-local production, which is building on the principles of open source software, where you have a car, the Wikispeed car, or electronic circuit boards, Arduino. There's FarmHack, and I think it's called Eco, there's another similar one doing farm equipment on open source principles. So it's cheap, locally sourceable, modular, not patented. And of course, Fab Labs are a part of this. I like to think that the fashion world could imagine its own cosmo-local productions, reduce the carbon emissions of transport and empower local economies through this model, which is still in a very fledgling state, but showing great promise. Another important thing is to shed some of our archaic vocabularies. I know Pascal had mentioned the importance of language. I think language, as it exists, locks us in to a lot of assumptions and premises about how the world is or should work. But I think there's a whole new language of commenting that helps us get beyond some of that. Simply being able to talk about enclosure is in advance, but I, for example, have trouble with the word resource. And a lot of us now talk about care wealth, which means a different kind of relationship to what an economist might say, oh, that's a resource, what's the price? Care wealth has a different affective relationship. Or people talk about the individual. I like to talk about the nested I. I'm nested within other communities to which have a claim on me and to which I contribute. So I think language is an important tool for starting to reorient ourselves to discover new strategic directions. And finally, I had mentioned emulate and federate. I think this is the way that we scale. We don't scale to a unified single movement or organization. We have all sorts of diversified players who copy each other in their own local circumstances and then federate under new terms. And I think this creates what might be called a commonsverse, which is like a parallel social economy. We can already see it in a lot of digital spaces where you have free software, Creative Commons licensed content, wikis, Wikipedia, open access scholarly journals, and it goes on and on, all of whom loosely cooperate with each other towards a shared agenda of free culture. So I will leave you with the idea that I think the next big thing will be a lot of small things. But the lesson is, how can we find the connective tissue? How can we find the cultural norms and the language to connect these small things so that we can have our authentic, diversified local identities, but still realize we're part of a larger evolving story, which I think the Commons help speak to and frame. So with that, I will conclude my remarks, and I hope we can have some more conversation in the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and that was very impressive to introduce to us, reintroduce the Commons in exactly 20 minutes. I forgot to mention fasten your seatbelts because it was quite something, but I think the notions, the principles that David was sharing with us are very important to keep in mind also when we think about these different universes we want to connect to each other. And the beautiful thing is, it is reintroducing Commons because in Dutch there is a word for it. Domains is the word we use for Commons, and it's a very old practice, but we can reintroduce a practice thanks to technology, thanks to new things that we are introducing, and therefore it becomes a very important topic. We'll have later on a panel discussion about this, but first, our second speaker. Our second speaker has been exploring sustainability within the fashion for already 20 years, and in his little talk and the video he will present, he will share with us his experience of these last 20 years. He's the founder and creative director of Osklen, the founder of the Brazilian Instituto E. Please, a very warm welcome to Oscar Metzevat. There he is. Microphone is there. All yours.
Hello, everybody. First, I'd like to thank this very prestigious invitation to be here. Thank you, Jose, to invite me to come here and say some words. First of all, I'm a very romantic but not naive optimist about our world, about our sustainability in this planet. Because if we are here now, all of us together, thinking about that, and so many other conferences and people doing things thinking on sustainability and social impact in the world, I really think that I'm very, very glad to be living in this generation. I think our generation, maybe it's one of the most important generations we could have in our civilization. Because if we see our planet and the adventure of the human being, the human thinking and doing things in our civilization, the planet had already been many times in almost dying planet. Since the glacial era, through the disease we had, through the big wars, through the atomic aggressions we could have, we had so many times in our civilization that the planet could be dying. The planet is dying, but I think the human race, again, I really think we are living a Renaissance movement now. We are Renaissance people here. We are noble people. Because I really think the mindset of the society, the world society, has changed already. We know already how to keep this planet alive. We have the technologies and ideologies and thinkings from the 21st century. The human beings, we changed our mindset. It begins with people like us. So I'm a very optimist. Sometimes people think I'm naive, but that's why things like that are happening now. ASAP, as sustainable as possible, as soon as possible. I'd like to share with you this movie. It is the first time it's going to be screened. It became ready just one day ago. I've had some young directors to do that. It's about our experience in the last 20 years. When I began, I remember that in a project that was conceptually talk just 1% of my collection. But that just 1% meant 100% of a small family, agriculture family plantation in northeast of Brazil. We have to remember that we have to begin something. It's quite utopic to be 100% sustainable. If we try to do that, if society asks for that, if certification asks for that, maybe we are not being inclusive, we are including to sustainable development. We need to begin with something and get as soon as possible to 100%. So this movie we are going to show 4 of our projects, but this collection that we have now in the stores, we have more than 200 references on sustainable products, made from more than 50 different materials we have developed in the last 20 years. Please, can you turn off the light and begin the film? I begin with the human being. His relationship with what surrounds us, with the environment. When the spirit and the mind express it through a layer over the body. My work is to interpret and create these layers. A human body in balance with the city, the metropolis, and nature. This is what I think Brazil can really bring to the world, the energy of our people and our natural resources. Preserving this wealth is the responsibility we have been given. It's a choice between further exploitation or preservation.
We realize we must do that for the ocean. That the world we want, nossa sustentabilidade, está em nossas próprias mãos.
We are talking about innovation.
Que a gente discuta muito mais do que é possível fazer. Represent the people from Rio, the people from Brazil, and the people from the world.
I consider Oscar my communication platform. It is the integrated perception of nature, culture, and society, associated with a sophisticated aesthetic. It's where I express values such as the pursuit of sustainable development and the concept of the new luxury. The new luxury represents a lifestyle compatible with sustainability values. It's a way of being that is the contrary of exhibitionism. The new luxury consists of assigning sophisticated design to sustainable materials, bringing together the aesthetics with ethics, which is the sophistication of sustainable material. The fabrics have the intention of communicating and representing these values. It's made by materials whose origin and production process respect a fair trade criteria and sustainable development.
Recycled cotton comes from the reuse of textile waste, fabrics and knits that would be discarded by the industry. The recycling process, which eliminates dyeing and reduces water consumption. The water used in the dyeing processes returns to the rivers free of chemicals and with the appropriate pH. The use of this material promotes upcycling, helps to clean the planet, and to generate jobs. Fabrics made from recycled cotton are an industry alternative to avoid environmental pollution. Pirarucu is Brazil's largest freshwater fish. It's a fish destined basically for food. Its skin is often dismissed as junk. Its leather has a greater resistance than bovine leather, although it's thinner and softer. The capture of pirarucu is done consciously and not predatory, with respect to environmental laws and breeding periods of species. It contributes to the formation of associations of small colonies of fishermen, stimulating the generation of jobs and allowing a 30% increase in the income obtained by these small producers.
Nosso trabalho é assim, eu venho com os conceitos, experiências, penso às vezes em textura, em cores, em formas, uma experiência emocional que eu tive, ou uma viagem, elementos que eu vou trazendo.
Isso aqui é o começo. Tem um começo que a equipe ainda está na outra coleção e eu e o Oscar já estamos aqui.
E, na verdade, a gente usa o caderno, eu acho que o caderno é muito mais um espaço para sensibilidade, assim, é o que a palavra, o que não cabe na palavra está aqui, né?
Então já é uma troca real estética entre nós, onde compartilha, sabe, formas, elementos, você vê cores, texturas. E a partir disso, quando entra no consenso, né, Ju, parte para a definição do que é a coleção e da construção dela. E essas trocas vão acontecendo durante o processo, depois do desenho ainda, da Juliana, ao processo de desenvolvimento com o restante da equipe de design de moda. Começa a haver uma troca e uma construção dos elementos com uma direção de estilo minha, de conceito, estilo, direção de arte, mas uma direção de design de moda, de linguagem de moda da Juliana. E esse encontro nosso, esse trabalho nosso, ele cria uma bela poesia.
The fiber of natural silk is a continuous threading of a protein produced by the caterpillar of certain kinds of moths. Unlike its industrial production, the artisan growth of cocoons is made in plantations where there's no use of agrotoxics. And natural pigments from the Brazilian biodiversity are used. The different color shades make the product become a unique piece, exclusive and non-reproductive. Regaining the artisan techniques, where the threading is made in natural forms, the process of making income to the communitary groups is much easier, making it suitable to the parameters of social responsibility and environmental respect.
Aqui meu ateliê tem uma mistura do meu trabalho de arte, meu trabalho de design e meu trabalho ligado às questões sustentáveis, ambientais. Uma coisa puxa a outra. Meu gestual como artista, eles são a síntese de um conceito ou de uma experiência. Você vê que eu não trabalho assim diretamente com a moda. Aqui são os conceitos, as experiências, os meus gestos como arte, minha sensibilidade. Daqui que sai conceito e alguns elementos para as próximas coleções. É mergulhando não uma questão, óbvio, somente estética. Afinal, moda são formas, são texturas. Estou mergulhando os conceitos de desenvolvimento sustentável. Eu estou sendo convidado a participar de várias conferências mundiais sobre o assunto. E eu estou vivendo isso. Acho que cada coleção é o que eu estou vivendo naquele momento.
Recycled polyester fiber from PET packaging is an ecological product because it means the removal from the environment of a material that is difficult to decompose, which are responsible for 30% of the solid waste collected in Brazilian municipalities. Over 400,000 rag pickers are involved in the collection and selection of recyclable materials. The combination of these polyester fibers with cotton fibers enables the creation of a knitted fabric that has just the same resistance, durability, and colors as products made with conventional polyester.
Na hora que a gente começou a desenhar e a pensar como usar, né, seguir, né, o as sustainable as possible, surgiu uma quantidade enorme de matérias-primas e aí a gente inverteu um pouco o processo que a gente sempre faz, que é desenhar uma coleção e depois, né, em busca daquele tecido que a gente imaginou, do shape que a gente planejou, inspirou. O que acabou acontecendo foi uma inversão desse processo. Os materiais inspiraram a gente, a montagem, a criação, o próprio desenho, né? O desenho de cada look veio a partir de uma matéria-prima e das suas limitações. Então, aquilo que poderia ser uma limitação vira uma inspiração.
O tingimento também tem um aspecto super interessante, que ele não fica completamente uniforme, né? Então, cada produto é único.
Isso se reflete no produto, eu acho, quando você fala em design e o uso desses materiais, porque eu acho que você passa a criar um respeito maior também por esse tipo de matéria-prima. Então, o design acaba ficando mais puro, né? Você tenta interferir menos, valorizar a matéria-prima. Então, a gente transformou em peças especiais, em quantidades limitadas.
É um processo de aprendizado mesmo, assim, em todos os sentidos. Trabalhar com produto e entender o quanto a gente pode usar aquele produto dentro da coleção.
A gente usa justamente, por exemplo, essa cor. A gente não pediu essa cor, né? Essa cor aconteceu. Então, a partir disso, a gente pensa que cabedal faz sentido para essa cor.
We have developed a shoe soldering containing rubber trimmings and residues of rice, straw, and cork that would be discarded. The use of these materials encourages the reuse and correct disposal of waste and avoids soil degradation, reducing its impact in nature. It doesn't just help preserving the environment, but also promotes a source of income for the workers involved in the process.
Se você juntar, empoderar grupos comunitários e, ao mesmo tempo, valorizar os materiais produzidos na floresta, você conseguiria promover o desenvolvimento humano sustentável. Nós fomos procurando esses grupos e, ao mesmo tempo, pesquisando também os materiais que eles trabalhavam. E nosso propósito nunca foi chegar em alguma comunidade com uma receita de bolo e, de uma certa maneira, vamos dizer, violar os saberes tradicionais. Muito pelo contrário, nós sempre tivemos uma atitude de respeito. Mas, ao mesmo tempo, nós entendíamos que a questão do design era fundamental para ele ganhar em escala, fazer com que, por exemplo, gere cada vez mais renda e, consequentemente, empoderamento para essas comunidades. A OSCLE é muito aberta a propostas inovadoras, então a gente diz que a OSCLE é o nosso laboratório de inovação. A moda feita no modelo linear leva ao esgotamento de recursos naturais, muitas vezes exploração injusta da mão de obra. Só faz sentido hoje em dia você desenvolver uma moda com propósito, uma moda com, vamos dizer, com um aspecto mais humanista e ao mesmo tempo solidário com o planeta. Quando a gente promove o uso de materiais sustentáveis feito por uma mão de obra comunitária, é da maior importância.
Eu acredito que cada vez mais a moda tem que estar a serviço das grandes causas, né? A moda ela é uma expressão cultural de um momento. Se nós olharmos como as pessoas se vestiam há um tempo atrás, nós vamos ver como as pessoas viviam. Quando você veste uma roupa da OSCLE, você está vestindo a ideia que existe comprometida com uma cadeia de sustentabilidade, com as comunidades que produzem aquele algodão, com o impacto que isso causa para quem fabrica a roupa que você veste. Então, o Instituto E, ele nasceu para materializar o compromisso da OSCLE e dar concretude a essa preocupação.
Tem feminino, tem umas peças, tem um coletão, deve fazer uma produção embaixo.
20 years ago, we launched our first organic cotton t-shirts. Now OSCLE consolidates itself as the largest sustainable development laboratory in Brazilian fashion industry. Our collections are reinforcing to the market and society not only our pioneering with the question of sustainability, but also to renewing our commitment through these 20 years as a reference of conscious and innovative practice in the fashion segment, national and internationally. Since 2002, the production of e-fabric by OSCLE has risen from 1,000 pieces to almost 137,000 pieces by 2015. The raw materials are really the protagonists, and my design team had as a starting point sustainable material that give rise to diverse e-fabrics. The shapes, silhouettes, colors, textures, and trim of our fashion shows are the result of a meticulous, organic, and innovative work. And the result is a perfect balance between the technological and the artisanal. The world is changing. Soon it will be irrelevant where you are from. There will be no more geographical nations. Instead, there will be lifestyle nations. People around the world will connect based on ideas and attitudes that represent its values. I want to be a part of a sustainable lifestyle nation, and I want to make sure that in my generation we did it. What we are doing now is a call for the urgency of adopting more sustainable practices and attitudes, bringing to everyone the concept that has always guided us, ASAP, as sustainable as possible, as soon as possible. It's a paradigm shift. It's an invitation to the world and to Brazil. Act now for a better present and a better future. Let's leave a better world to the next generations. Again, thank you very much. I hope this film could help better than I'm speaking. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Oscar, for showing us the world premiere of As Sustainable as Possible. As soon as possible, may I invite the other panelists to come here on stage. The chair will arrive. Oscar will also get a chair. Yeah, please come here on stage. David, Pascal, and Louise Fresco is also amongst us. Please have a seat here so we can discuss further these topics. The four panelists are now coming here on stage. Oscar we met, David we met, Pascal we saw earlier this morning as head of the master here in Artes. And please have a seat. They're all yours. Come over here, yeah. And the person we haven't met yet is Louise Fresco, somebody who is, like Oscar, has already been searching for sustainability in fashion for 20 years. Louise has been thinking and working and writing about food, the future of food, healthy food, the availability of food for a long time. She writes about it in novels, in academic papers, and of course, she's the president of Wageningen University Research and Executive Board. So we're really happy that she can be with us and to discuss the new luxury from different perspective. Let's see how we can, well, get things a bit further based also on the keynotes from David and Oscar. But Louise, if I may start with you. You bring, I think, to this debate two different interesting angles. The part of science, you're also cooperating together with Artes. How can science and research be useful in finding new ways of developing our systems, but also the perspective of food. Because in many ways, of course, the issues of food and the availability of food has some comparisons with fashion. The availability to such a huge amount of people. How do you produce it in a sustainable way? So these two angles are, I think, very interesting. You can start, if you would like to start with the food one or the science one as a perspective. Then maybe Pascal could be interesting to discuss the educational part. And then let's see if David and Oscar would like to respond on your notions. But Louise, where would you like to start?
Let me start with the food, perhaps.
Okay.
Because I think basically food and clothing have, on the deepest level, very many things in common. The first thing to understand is they're both biological products. They're products from nature. They're perhaps the most intimate way in which we communicate with nature. In the case of food, even more so than with clothes, because we ingest actually nature when we eat. But both are produced from natural fibers or natural chemicals through an ecological process. And what we do as humans, of course, is that we use knowledge, science, to make sure that we get the best possible product. So, for example, that we have food that is not going to waste immediately, that has the best content of vitamins and so on. And we want fibers that don't use themselves up within a few days. And even the artificial fibers that we know that come from petrochemicals, from the chemical industry, or in fact are also still fossil natural fibers. So everything you wear basically is natural. Now, there are some lessons to be learned, I think, from the food community and food production and the history of that for fashion. First of all, I think both are very emotional. Food is identity. Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you who you are. Tell me what you wear, and I tell you who you are. And that means that it's very difficult to actually talk about food and fashion in general. Your taste may not be mine in food or in fashion. But there are, for us and for me as a scientist, of course, there are some basic principles that are very important. And one I would characterize as the devil is in the details. It's the details of how we produce that make up whether something is sustainable or not. In my view, sustainability really is not an easy sort of 100%. It's a trade-off between different types of goals. For example, a good example is if you say we don't want to have cotton grown on fields anymore, we only want to have recycled cotton, just let's assume as a hypothesis that that would be possible, then of course that sounds very good from an environmental perspective, but the fact that we don't take away a livelihood from small farmers in India also has a negative social cost. So on the famous dimensions, people, profit, planet, that we know from the first Rio summit and reaffirmed at the second Rio summit of the Sustainable Development Goals or Millennium Development Goals, it's very important to understand that there is hardly ever something like an absolute form of sustainability. But there is an issue of effects locally or effects at a longer distance, effects now and effects in the future. And so for me, the most important thing is to really do what we call, and I think you call that also in fashion, a sort of life cycle analysis. If we want to go for alternatives, let's really go and calculate what we want to do. Now, definitely using and reusing, for example, fibers is, of course, an excellent idea. But in itself, it's not enough. We should also look at how much water does that actually ask, how much energy is involved when we clean up things, what kinds of dyes are we using. For us at our university in Wageningen, one of the most interesting things is actually to look also at food waste as a source for fiber. Because food waste just in Europe actually represents like 6% of Europe's CO2 emissions. So it's really very important to look at that. And we've been...
Yes, let's start with this life cycle notion, for instance. So what does it mean for designers, either from the food perspective, from the fashion perspective? How can they be more in control, responsible of this whole cycle? Because now, of course, we're compartmentalized and also
exactly.
a very hard...
And one of the problems I think we have, and we've we've done this collectively, is that we try to optimize on little fragments of the whole production chain.
Exactly.
And so what we really need, and this is also very important to education, and also the way we teach it in Wageningen, is that we look at the whole cycle. And that even starts before we're talking about production. It starts about what kind of inputs do you need? And how does this go all the way down to the consumer? And one of the things here is that technology will actually help us. We now have sensors and ways to even weave into materials something that can actually help us to trace all the way from source to the ultimate consumer, so that the consumer also has the security that what he or she buys actually has that authenticity. Yeah. And I think that will give a far greater comfort to people. And this applies to food as well as to fashion and textiles, and maybe to everything else, the wood of our floors and our... so we're moving, in fact, and this is where I fully agree with the two of you, this is about a paradigm shift. It's a paradigm shift going from a linear economy to a circular economy where everything is a resource, even if you object to the term, but is a source again for new production. And I think that's actually that's what ecology is all about.
Yeah, yeah. Let's also focus on the science, but a little bit later. Let's go to Pascal also, because Louisa mentioned the part of education. It was interesting in the notion of the commons. Respect was many times mentioned in the documentary about Oscar and his work. Respect, commons, how do you put that also in your educational framework that you've been building up to? And are these also the notions that you think are the core of what the future of education, preparing next generations for this kind of future?
Yeah, I think I take a slightly different perspective than maybe the commons. Definitely, I very much connected to, and also, well, everyone actually. But I think for me it starts with reconnecting to our own well-being and our own sense of joy and play. Because I truly believe that we have put ourselves in service of the market, in service of capitalism, and that we've lost a sense of commoning. And we don't even know what it is. So for me, it was very helpful to see the frameworks that you were presenting, and also touching upon language and kind of redefining maybe how we use the words so that we have access to another understanding of how we can be together. Because I don't think we understand anymore how we can be together. And I think that's where it starts, basically. Because I think if once we can reconnect to ourselves, and through reconnecting to ourselves, we can connect to each other again, then we will reconnect to nature, and we will reconnect to an awareness. Because for me, and I think that's interesting that you mentioned that, for me it has been with the Friends of Light project that I'm, it's a small business that I have. I started working with farmers directly for the materials that we use. And our whole value chain is human relationships. And for me, working with farmers has been so important to understand again where the fibers come from, and to build the fiber from farming and feeling that connection to the land again. And then talking about ritual and kind of celebration and understanding. So for me, it really starts with connection to ourselves and then a connection to each other. And then from there, how do we start to understand commoning again as a practice that will then connect us to an ecological consciousness that is much greater and more natural than anything else I could imagine.
Okay. Oscar, could you respond on that? Like Pascal said, tries to grasp somewhere we lost this commonness. So where did it start for you, where you try to reconnect with your surroundings, because it's obviously something you did?
I think it's about collaboration. I think when you work, if you think about, in our case, working with fashion, first of all, it's the expression on what you believe and you want to share with the others. This is about fashion expression. It's not, of course, about doing clothing or looking for trends and transforming it into commodities like clothing. Fashion is express a lifestyle, a concept, your beliefs. And to do that, you collaborate. You collaborate with your suppliers. You collaborate with your team. You collaborate with society. So we are living now in the moment, the commons, it's becoming. more than the millennials. The millennials are understanding that the value behind products and services are much more important than the status, the symbol of it. People are beginning to understand that the collaborative process is completely different. The actual consumerism that we have, we buy more, buy less. We want more status, buy less. We want more, buy less. It's changing. It's becoming to have less, but this less is huge on what has on behind. So this collaborative process, it's happening. Again, what I said in the beginning, if we are here discussing it, it's just because it's the beginning of this changing.
Yeah. Well, I think David doesn't agree with that, because that's also something you have been professing for a long time. But where do we start with making these new connections or collaboration, how Oscar mentioned it?
Well,
you were also discussing the local rootedness of an important part of this notion of common. Where do we...
I think that OSCON has accomplished some remarkable things in developing a more holistic picture, the recycling, the engagement of small players, and the rest. I guess, for me, however, capital-driven markets are famously ruthless, and the voluntary initiatives of some remarkable companies often aren't playing out as broadly as they need to, I think, in the economy. And moreover, I think that a lot of it cannot be market-mediated relationships. It needs to be human-mediated relationships, the way Pascal was talking about. And I think there are new institutional forms that can give those greater expression and durability beyond sharing. I might add, the sharing economy is not Uber or Airbnb. Those are micro-rental economies. They're not sharing. And so I think the point is genuine human sharing, interaction, collaboration for these larger purposes is essential. Whether our institutional forms will get us there or not is another conversation.
Okay, Louisa, do you also agree with Pascal that we somewhere lost this feeling of common, being part of a community where we are so participants instead of just...
Well, I think everybody wants and must connect to a community, and that community exists on different levels, at the personal level, you know, the institution, the country, etc. But I do want to sound one note of caution here, because I think it's easy to say it has to be human transactions, face-to-face, locally sourced. The reality is, of course, that we have 2/3 of the world population quite soon in urban centers. Already we have more than 35 cities of more than 10 million inhabitants. There are many, many parts where this local connectedness is not so easy, and where poverty is still a real issue. And we all know that it's the poor that, although if they are in the Amazon, I agree, they may be very much in balance with nature, but very often the urban poor in slums, whether it's Nairobi or Mumbai or wherever, have no chance, no choice not to pollute or not to buy things that are cheaply and poorly made. And so I would also look towards solutions, finding a local scale, but also still a value chain that gives the best possible sustainable values to those who are not able to go for the real fashion. In the end, I think the responsibility of the industry is to make sure that also through our designing and invention or reinvention of the whole value chain, we also reach those who are very hard to reach and maybe the ones that don't have that easy, beautiful human connection. There will be other types of connections, but poverty is a very, very strong factor still in our societies, and we should take some responsibility for that.
Okay, now that you're, again with you, Louise, now you said that you're critical anyway, let's go on to be critical. Some critical notions, for instance, on the circular economy are also, well, a circular economy doesn't change our mindset because it's still about consuming. I mean, you consume anyway because we'll do it in a circular way, so it's fine to consume more and more. So doesn't these notions, like, it's great, it's possible, but then again, are we not talking about more fundamental changes in how we do things and just mentioning it?
I think we're talking really about cultural change or paradigm shift here.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, if we wait for that, what we produce and consume, we better do it in the best possible way.
Okay.
The problem with such fundamental things like food, it's even stronger for food than it is for fashion, is that we have a strong need to want to have things. And I think for food, this is such a fundamental biological driver that makes it very hard for people to stop.
Yep.
And we've done a lot of experiments in Wageningen showing that people do not naturally stop eating if you feed them in a certain way. And this is a very... well, no, but let me explain the experiments.
Except for Ramadan, of course.
In 1/2 second. No, but I mean, if you have people and you put them around the table and you feed them soup, and under the table there is a pump that actually continues to pump soup into the plates. People, apart from 10%, 90% of the people will not stop eating.
Wow.
Although we know in their brains that the satiation point has already been reached. And that is because the drive to feed or clothe or protect ourselves is very, very strong.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult for people to change that, to think, I have enough. And what we need is indeed to move to a culture and an economy of enough, of quality rather than quantity and so on. But it's easy to say that. It's something that comes really with education in childhood. I think the one thing that we forget is that good habits in terms of sustainable behavior, in terms of caring for others, of human connectedness, come at a very early age. And that's probably what we have, we are lacking and we're not doing sufficiently. So in order to get us into a different type of drivers where it's not more, the more I have, we really also have to look at the generations who are now going to the cheap places where you buy clothes and you throw them out in 3 or 2 months and they're not in fashion anymore. The whole concept of what is in fashion is, of course, a very, very sensitive. And that also applies to food. Food also has fashions in a way. And discuss our awareness that it's about changing our attitude, our relationship to that natural world and what we take from it, I think is a real challenge. It doesn't come easily, and that's why I still think we need to find solutions. If we have to wait for 10 billion people to become a world society of enough, we'll have to wait a long time.
Okay. I would like to discuss more about science, but may I ask first Oscar and David to reflect very shortly about what do you expect from our educational system and for how we educate our future generations, but also the science perspective, what are the right questions, or how can science be impactful in the search that we're now currently doing. And then Pascal and Louise, you can reflect on well, what they're missing or what they would add to your very short notions on the use of education and science in this discussion.
I'd like to talk about the difference between food and fashion in sustainability. If you can see the organic food from a sustainable way, organic food have developed much more than on fashion. Because when we choose between an organic apple and a not organic one, we are having an advantage for ourselves. We are not thinking about not polluting the underwater soil with, with the plantations. So we have this choice, but it's a choice, it's an egoist choice, because you are thinking we have an advantage. In the fashion industry, if a piece of clothing, if it is my piece, if it comes from a sustainable process, or there is another one, exactly the same one, aesthetics, comfort, everything, that's not sustainable. For us consumers, I don't have any advantage between one or each other. In fashion, just people maybe educated like us, that have noble values like us, to understand that what is the value of paying more for that piece or choosing that sustainable piece, because we have noble values, because we don't have any advantage for ourselves as consumers. We bring advantages for the labor in the plantation that are not contaminating himself, for example. We help in not pollute the underwater for the next generations. We are helping the others. Yeah. In the consuming food, we have an advantage for ourselves. So it's very difficult to people understand, to educate society, these consumers, where If you pay more or you do the choice of a sustainable one, you don't have any advantage for yourself.
Yeah.
It's another kind of consumerism.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks so much. David.
Well, I agree. That's what makes this so remarkable, that within the market context, to achieve those things is extremely difficult. I think it's harder to build the relationships, to build the, for example, stewardship to the land, which is, I think, the source of saying this is enough, this is a limit. I think the market is famous for never having enough because you always want higher returns and you don't even have a personal relationship with the people or the ecosystem or whatever. So it's precisely developing these long-term relational relationships as opposed to cash transactions that I think is the cultural shift that we need to make, not simply as a policy or climate change issue, but as an internal issue to be more authentic human beings, to be better artists, to be more expressive of what we need to be. So I think that's sort of the integrated approach that will help us find a new paradigm. And I'm so thrilled to hear of this new curriculum trying to address some of that.
Right in the street of Pascal.
Well, I wanted to say that a friend of mine, she lives in Northampton, Sarah Aphrodite. I think some of you in the public might know her because she studied at Artes. And there's a worker cooperative there that collects trash by bicycle. And they do everything by hand. And they're amazing. They're called pedal people. And she has her trash being picked up by the pedal people. And she has a very different relationship to her trash now. She loves her trash now. And she takes great care of her trash. So for me, this connection to human beings and to the values they represent and the kind of effort and the intention that goes into picking up that trash by bicycle, which is a hard job because America is not like Holland. It's kind of going like this there. So, and in the winter and in the summer. So there's definitely ways in which we can start to understand our relationships to the materials and the world around us very differently if we start to connect on a human level to oh yes, I was in the panel today of business, alternative business, fashion business, and I'm sorry, I forgot your names, but you analyzed the crowdfunding campaigns in fashion that got were most successful, and they all had a social purpose, so they were connected to human relationships and understanding that human, like in your company. I'm sure that if that story gets out, people are more sensitive to buying that shirt than... So.
Yeah, okay. Lastly, Louise, what's for you the main task of education and science in developing and pushing this new narrative and this new way of working?
I think there are two basic dimensions. One is the cultural one that we have talked about, which is a matter of sensitizing people, of creating awareness of alternative or different ways of organizing markets or supply chains and so on, but also understanding, I would say, very much how the capitalist system works, because if you don't understand that, that has to be part of your education, and otherwise you'll be very naive. But again, the matter is in the details. So I would look towards students who also know how to analyze the different ways of producing things, of how satisfaction comes about. For example, you say in your organic apple, that's the difference between organic apple and fashion. I do not entirely agree. There is some very good research that shows that when people do something that's perceived as a good, objective, altruistic deed, it's the same type of neural systems in the brain that are activated. So whether it's an apple or wearing a dress out of recycled cotton, that may actually activate the same system. So understanding even the neurological basis of satisfaction, for example, would be an important one. But also understanding the chemistry and the ecology of how fibers can be used and reused and what design does. I think we all have the experience that if you have a piece of clothing that you really like for whatever reasons, you want to wear it more and more, and it will wear until, at least I have these things, until really holes appear. So there is some satisfaction in having things that last and that play a role in your own life, and learning also how to attach positive images to the objects that we have. And that's not just food or fashion, but also furniture. And so I think it's part of it. But you must be, certainly in our type of field, in biology and so on, you must also have a real quantitative understanding of what the differences are. Yeah. Because if you don't have that, then we end up in very, very vague, sort of beautiful statements, but we cannot really pinpoint where the difference is between an ordinary apple and a biological apple, or between organic cotton and recycled cotton. So if I may say one thing to the students, yes, literature, art, beautiful, but also learn how to calculate.
Louise, Pascal, David, Oscar, thanks so much. We have a 10-minute break, so very short. We get some water outside, we go to the loo, and in 10 minutes sharp, we're back for the second hour of 2 keynotes and a panel. Ladies and gentlemen, 1 hour to go before we head to the opening to State of Fashion. And during this hour, again, we have two very interesting, inspiring keynote speakers, after which we have a panel with two of them and with Otto as a third member of the panel to discuss a bit further the exploration of the new luxury. And I think the hour we just had was really interesting, not only to understand and try to understand these new principles of the commons, of showing respect, of understanding what we are as human beings and what our values are, but also that it's very important, like Louise stated, we also have to understand the current system to be able to do something with that. So it's two movements at the same time. Let's see what our second hour brings. And our first keynote speaker, she is a researcher lecturer at KEA Copenhagen School of Design and Technology, and the author of, it's already mentioned over there, Aesthetic Sustainability. Please, a very warm welcome to Christine Haber. Yeah, you can use the handheld or the, yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you very much for introducing me, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very pleased to be talking about one of my absolute favorite topics, aesthetic sustainability, which I also wrote a book about that you can see up here. But let me just start with a question that when I initially started working with the topic of aesthetic sustainability and the combination between sustainability and aesthetics, there was one question that was occupying me a lot. And it's basically the question that you see up here. The question about why it is that some things are important to us and that we get really sad when they get worn out. We even try maybe to repair them, maybe not always successfully. And other things are really quite insignificant to us. We don't really care about them. We maybe even forget that we have them. We stop using them. We find them somewhere in the back of our wardrobe if we're talking about garments, which we are today. Or we just kind of keep them because we think, oh, maybe one day I will, but we never do. I actually have a sweater that looks a little bit like the one up here. And it's become embarrassing to wear it now. But I still love it. And I actually came to the conclusion quite early in my research process that it has to do something with aesthetics. And even that some things get better when worn out, better when worn a lot, better when, you know, they almost become a part of you, when they almost become your second skin. But of course, a jumper like the one that you see up here, you can't wear all the time because the holes are just too big right now on the elbows. So it requires something as well from our products, the products that we buy, the products that we invest in, that we can use them for a long time and get connected to them and keep repairing them and so on. Just need the next slide. Yes, so my hypothesis is in my research process and what I've been writing about in my book, that the most sustainable object is an aesthetically sustainable object. And that means that it has some kind of long-lasting expression, but aesthetics, actually, when I work with it, is founded in philosophical aesthetics. I studied philosophy, so that's my background. And because of that, I look at aesthetics as not purely something that is beautiful to look at. You know, you often say, oh, it's a very aesthetic room, and then you maybe mean that it's got a beautiful color on the walls or whatever. Aesthetics, in the sense that it's used in philosophical research, is about all senses. So it's also about tactility, scent, taste even, certainly also about visuality, like sight, impressions and so on, but also about other senses. So when I say that a product that's sustainable, the most sustainable product is an aesthetically sustainable product, I also mean a product that can provide you with maybe some tactile pleasures of some sort, certainly also expressional durability, that the looks of them keep giving you pleasure of some sort, maybe because they are minimalistic and can fit into many different surroundings and occasions, or maybe because they are thought-provoking, interesting to return to again and again and again. And that also leads me to the next thing that I put on this slide, aesthetic decay, which is also something that I've worked very thoroughly with. The fact that some things decay in an aesthetically pleasing way is, I think, very important to look into when we work with sustainability. Of course, this can be about materials. It's not all materials that get worn out in a pleasing way, in a pleasing manner, but some do. Some materials actually get better when worn. They get more beautiful, more interesting, more you, more individual, more something. They certainly don't get uglier, more uninteresting, yet others do. There are certainly also materials that don't decay with beauty, which we probably all know. But it's not only about materials, it can also be about color combinations that maybe fade in the right way, etc. So there are many different dimensions to aesthetic decay, but it's important to think about, and I'm going to get back to that a little bit in a minute as well, because to think about the time from when you as a designer release an object into the world, what happens then? What happens in the consumer phase? How do these products develop? Do they decay with beauty? Do they remain interesting? Do they develop in an interesting way, in an aesthetically pleasing way? Or don't they? Because if they don't, they will most likely be discarded pretty quickly. So aesthetic decay is a really important concept as well. And aesthetic experiences, as I also put on the slide, are something that can make us feel at home in the world. It might sound a little bit spiritual. It also can be to an extent. But when you feel at home in the world, it's often because you feel comfortable in some way. And we all probably also know the feeling of entering a room that just feels good to be in. And it's largely connected to aesthetics, because the light doesn't shine in your eyes in an uncomfortable way, because the acoustics are comfortable, because the colors on the wall are pleasing. And that can also easily be transferred to other objects, like garments, for example. Now, I put this important 3 R's of sustainability on this slide, because I think they are good to remember: to reduce, reuse, and recycle. And I think they are all important. But to me, the most important R is reduce. And that is because no matter how good we are at recycling materials, it still requires a lot of natural resources to do so. No matter how much we reduce the natural resources we use, as like water, for example, it still requires water. And no matter how good we are at designing really good take-back systems, sustainable take-back systems, we still just have too many things in the world. So I hear often about these charity shops that receive discarded garments. They don't know what to do with it. They get so much. There are so many discarded garments in this world. We don't need that many. So recycling that many becomes really, really problematic. And then we just, end up burning them or whatever we hear about in the media, which is crazy. So actually, the most important thing is reducing consumption. And it's very easy sometimes as designers to sit and point fingers at the consumers. They buy so many things, they just throw them out. But it also requires something from the products, which has also been touched upon today in some of the other lectures. It really does require something from the products as well, that they can last. And we also have to be careful that it doesn't become this elitist thing. That sustainability is like, the new luxury, but luxury not necessarily expensive, not for the masses. Ideally, it is for the masses. But importantly, we have to reduce consumption. And then it's a good question to ask ourselves when we're talking about design, because my approach is really design-driven. My approach is that something has to happen in the design process itself. So it's a good thing to ask ourselves, what do we need to do about our product design in order for people to reduce consumption? What does it require from products, from garments, that people buy less things? What does it require? Well, I basically wrote a lot about it in the book, but to sum up some of the things that it requires, we could say that sustainable garments and products in general certainly have to be wear resistant. Of course, that's important that they do, or that they decay with beauty, but they certainly also have to be continuously aesthetically pleasing. And what does that mean? Well, that means, again, that we somehow, when we interact with these products, when we wear them, when we put them on in the morning, we feel nourished, almost like food. But, of course, differently. Of course, we don't actually get full when wearing a certain dress or shirt, but we feel nourished, our senses are pleased, and that fills us up as human beings. And I think that once we have experienced that, actually wearing something that does that to us, we're going to buy something like that the next time again, even though it's maybe more expensive, because of course it still will be more expensive than mass-produced garments. But I think once we've experienced that as consumers, I think we are more inclined to do it again, to invest in a lot less, but better, well thought through, well designed products, clothes, in this connection, of course. Another thing that's important is the next bullet point up here, that garments, products in general, have to be upgradable and repairable. Because if they aren't, it's very difficult for the common consumer to work with it. And I mean, like the picture I showed you initially of the jumper with the holes on the elbows, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to repair. But what if a repair kit had been thought in from the beginning? I know that designers are working with this now, but it could be done in many different ways. And that could be very important as well, to think that in. So it has to be possible to repair and upgrade products. And we have to maybe think that in the design process already, in order for things not to be obsolete, maybe because they are quality-wise obsolete, or maybe because they're perceived as such. Another important thing could be thinking about flexibility. Flexibility as in maybe modular garments of some sort, where little pieces can be changed in order to get a different look. Because we also have to remember that clothes are also a very important way to communicate. So we can't expect that people just wear the same black kimono for 365 days a year, even though it would be definitely the most sustainable behavior. And another thing that I'm really working a lot with at the moment is openness. And I live in Copenhagen at the moment, and when I cycle around Copenhagen, I always look up at the beautiful roofs of the city. Because in Copenhagen we have all these copper roofs, and what happens with copper, as you probably know, is that with time, when it gets oxygenated, interacts with air, it changes color. It becomes green. It gets a really beautiful, significant green color. And I really like that, the fact that when the roofs were made, they were not finished. They were kind of made like in copper, as that looks, like that kind of orangey color that copper has when it hasn't been yet interacting with the atmospheric changes. And then with time, they have changed and they have become what they were supposed to be. And I like that thought of maybe thinking like that a little bit when we design things, clothes as well, that when they leave the hands of the designer, maybe they are not finished yet. Maybe they are open. Maybe it isn't until people start wearing them, until they become a part of a human being and their wear starts to shape it, that it becomes finished or done, if it even ever does. So that's a different way of thinking time into products, something that I've worked with a lot. Initially, I really worked a lot with time, adding time to products as the production time, that you would maybe leave some kind of visible traces of the production time in a garment of some sort, and in that way add value to it. And I think that's a very important way, actually, of doing it. I mean, most common, easy example of that is like a knitted jumper. I mean, you can actually see the process of it if it's in hand knitted. So adding time to a product like that is very maybe important, of adding value and telling the story of all the many hours that have been spent creating this, also maybe hand-woven stuff is a good example of that. But also thinking time into a product in the other way, I really find important and interesting. That we think of the time that what happens after the product has been released into the world, what happens when the consumer starts interacting. That it's not a matter of when it's new, it's perfect, and then it starts going downhill. The more it gets worn, it just gets worse and worse and worse until we really can't use it anymore. But that we rather think of it as, okay, we're here, it's being sent into the world, and then it starts developing into something else, which it's supposed to be. And then the last point on this slide is aesthetic nourishment. Oh, yeah, you can leave this one. I'll get to that in a minute. But aesthetic nourishment, I've already touched upon, but aesthetic nourishment is a concept that I've worked with a lot. The idea that we actually get nourished, filled up when we have an aesthetic experience. That it's an important part of human well-being. And that once we've experienced it, we seek it again and again. And when we do that, that could be a very sustainable consumer behavior. Aesthetic sustainability is quite closely connected to emotional durability, which is a concept that I think most of you are quite familiar with. The idea that if you get emotionally connected to a product, then you are inclined to keep it, preserve it, maintain it, and of course that's a sustainable behavior. However, aesthetic sustainability is slightly different as well. This here is a girl called Cyril. She is from Norway, and it's a picture from a project called Local Wisdom, which was, it's still ongoing, and it's basically about collecting stories about emotional connectivity between people and their clothes. And this girl chose to bring this jumper here. And she's really, really pleased about it, and she tells a story about how she inherited it from her grandmother, who inherited it from her mother, etc. And it was hand-knitted by the great-grandmother, and that's, of course, a very beautiful and important story to her, and that's why she's connected to it, she says, and I'm sure it is. But furthermore, she says that it's her favorite shirt. And I mean, that's where the difference comes in, because it works for her. It's not only something that she's pleased about because she inherited it, it's also her favorite shirt. She wears it again and again. It works for her aesthetically. It somehow works for her identity. She likes the colors of it, the feel of it, the slightly heavy knit of it, the combination of the cold buttons and the warm yarn, etc. And that's more about aesthetic qualities. And also, I mean, when I look at what, I've also inherited a lot of things from my grandparents, and most of these things I keep because they provide me with memories of some sort, but they are stored away. It's only very few of them that work for me aesthetically. And that's the difference between emotional durability and aesthetic sustainability. That aesthetic sustainability is also about, aesthetics, something that actually works for you. It's not only about the emotional bond. And another very important thing is that I find emotional durability slightly difficult to work strategically with. When you look at all the stories that you can collect about emotional connectivity between people and their things, they are very subjective. It's because they got it from their boyfriend, or they found it in a market in Nepal, or they, inherited this from their grandmother, or whatever. So very subjective stories that you can, of course, work with as themes. It could be, if we're talking about the grandmother, it could be the theme of homeliness, perhaps, that you work with. However, aesthetics can be slightly more universal, which I've also been working a lot with in my book. And you can set up some different ways that you can actually try and create something that will have a broad aesthetic appeal based on perhaps color harmonies, tactile stimulation, combinations of tactility, etc., etc. That makes it possible to actually set a strategy for the aesthetic experience you'd like your receiver to have as a part of your design process. So that's one of the things that's quite different between it. And you could also easily go in here and make an aesthetic analysis of why this works for her. How are we doing with the time? 2 minutes. Okay, so I'll take the last slide anyway. It was my buffer slide, but you get it. So just very quickly, in my book, I have worked with, as I said, the aesthetic strategy, which is a design-driven approach to sustainability. And it's a strategy that is supposed to be implemented in the design process. And in this strategy, I'm actually very inspired by the traditional philosophical division between the beautiful and the sublime in philosophical aesthetics. And I've translated these concepts into what I call the pleasure of the familiar and the pleasure of the unfamiliar. And just very briefly about this, it was really important to me to have both of them as a part of what you can work with. Because I think very often when we think about something that's aesthetical and maybe durable because of aesthetics, we think minimalistic, neutral, something that can fit in many different occasions or surroundings. And I think that can certainly be aesthetically sustainable. But at the same time, I also think that sometimes the most aesthetically sustainable garments or products are perhaps the ones that are really challenging, the ones that have a really complex expression that you return to again and again, and every time you do, they kind of provoke you a little bit, or because they are asymmetrical or whatever, your eye just has to capture them. And again, that time that gives you to interact with them can also create durability. So they are actually parallel ways that you can work with aesthetic sustainability, and of course there are many different dimensions to them both. But it was just really important to me, inspired by the sublime aesthetic experience, to also have that kind of complex, challenging part of aesthetic sustainability in my book, and not only the kind of minimalistic, neutral expression that I think is probably what most people initially would think about if I said aesthetic durability. Now, those were the words. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christine, for explaining how we perceive and how we can work with aesthetic in a different way to define new luxury. You will be later on stage to discuss it a bit further, or so I hope. Our next speaker. As a response to the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh, she, together with Carrie Somers, founded in 2013 Fashion Revolution, a not-for-profit global movement that campaigns for systemic reform of the fashion industry with a focus on the need for greater transparency in the fashion supply chain. But she's also the founder and designer of upcycling fashion label From Somewhere and many, many other things. Please give her a warm welcome, Ursula de Castro.
The last slide?
No.
Which one? The curse of technology. Can I go and sew with her instead? Okay. So, my name is Ursula de Castro, and I'm a recovering fashion designer. I was also the founder and curator of Estetica, the British Fashion Council Sustainable Area at London Fashion Week between 2006 and 2014. And I am a visiting fellow at Central St. Martin's. And I am the creative director and co-founder of Fashion Revolution, which started as a result of the Rana Plaza disaster, when we really felt that enough was enough when it came to the situation in the fashion industry and our desire for cheap, fast clothing to the detriment of other people. In this case, the death of 1,134 young women and 2,500 injured people who probably won't ever work again. So, who are we? Fashion Revolution is a coalition of several people. It is now the biggest fashion advocacy movement in the world. So we started really relatively simply with, our focus was very much on transparency. And we were born with a somehow cri du coeur, which is, who made my clothes? Because the truth is that the fashion supply chain is convoluted, inefficient, and hidden. And the people we should value, the people we should respect, the people that are producing the clothes that we wear every single day are invisible to us. And they're often working in very unappealable and unappealing conditions, working overtime, underpaid, always underpaid actually. There are almost no factories amongst the big mainstream that pay a living wage. So there are so many issues. And as Fashion Revolution, for us, transparency was somehow the first port of call. Not that we know that transparency is the one solution. In fact, we are acutely aware that it's just a starting point. But transparency is the birth of something, a first step. And not just in a very practical term, showing you who makes your clothes in the supply chain, but it's a huge cultural change when it comes to the fashion industry. This industry is based on elitism, on closed doors, on secrecy. Obviously, it is in secrecy and in closed doors that we have human rights abuses, environmental abuses, that there is a disrespect for diversity considered acceptable. So for us, campaigning for transparency was a way of challenging this industry from its very, very core and saying, you know, we want something different. We want to change the status quo for a better industry. And so we started with, this is our Fashion Transparency Index. This is last year's version, which was downloaded over 40,000 times. And you can find everything that we do is downloadable for free on our website, so you can find the current version available at www.fashionrevolution.org. Interestingly enough, our campaign is growing exponentially. As I said, it started with a hashtag. Sometimes as a grown woman, I find it really bizarre that I'm talking hashtags here. But, you know, this is how we operate, and we are, you know, we are an online campaign as well as a physical campaign. There were, I think, over 2,000 events this year. But yeah, we took hashtags. And sometimes it's lovely. So who made my clothes? It spanned another hashtag, which is called I Made Your Clothes, which shows that producers and people that do make our clothes throughout the fashion supply chain really want to be seen, really want to be there, really want you to meet them, because they are just as proud of making the clothes that you wear as you should be of wearing them. But we started enlarging our scope for campaigning, and transparency is no longer our main focus. And we are now looking more and more at waste, at the environmental implications of the fashion industry, its impact. Waste is something which you will probably, I'll show you a little bit later in my slides a little bit later. I've been knee-deep in waste since 1997, one thing and another. But the fact is that we are facing an absolute crisis. Actually, I think that the issue of waste is going to be comparable to sweatshops in the 90s when it comes to, when we will begin to understand the extent that mass production and mass consumption, the extent of the impact that it has, not just on the resources that we use, but actually on those that we don't use and on all that we discard. I mean, we are producing right now approximately 150 billion garments of clothing per year. And we are discarding pretty much as fast as we are acquiring. So according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, we are producing, those 150 billion somehow translate to around 53 to 56, sorry, I'm a bit dysnumeric, number of millions of tons produced, and we are discarding 78% of that. It's going either into landfill or in incineration. According to Professor Jen Bailey, approximately 1/3 of retail clothes aren't sold, they're just being thrown away. The average lifetime of a piece of clothing is 3.3 years. And yet, if we prolong the life of clothing, as we've heard before, whichever way we find, because we're all different, you know, we're all individual, fashion is individual. I actually love wearing holes, and my most elegant dress is covered with it. It's 1940s. I just wear it with a long string of pearls. It's so elegant. It's practically a hole with a bit of dress around it. But, you know, it's for all of us to find a solution. But this is a solution. So we are literally changing the geology of the earth with the waste that we leave behind, says Professor Kate Goldsworthy. And because we do the Fashion Transparency Index, so, you know, we survey brands a lot all the time, we know that there is zero transparency when it comes to brands disclosing actually what they do with their waste. What is the waste? Often they will say, well, you know, it's off-cuts, it gets downcycled, mattress filling. What about surplus? And we've just about getting to the point in which we understand what's happening to post-consumer waste. We know its effect, but we really know very, very little about what's happening to the waste that's produced from the mills and from the factories. In fact, we are producing so much post-consumer waste that there are entire countries that are refusing to let it in. So East Africa, Haiti, why? Because with our influx of stupidly pre-stressed denim, we don't even have the time to distress our own materials. We buy them pre-distressed by others who incidentally die because of the chemicals that are being used in that, you know, it's really lost any kind of sense here. But when I was little, giving to charity was an act of goodness. And right now, giving to charity is an act of dumping. It has disastrous consequences. So we know about circularity. I'm a huge believer that technology will save us. I'm still marveling at the electronic calculator, and I've seen how far we've gone since then. So I can see how far we will continue to go. But the point I'd like to make today, and something I discuss regularly with brands and students, is what in between. So if we are producing 150 billion garments of clothing, and those are the clothing that we are producing, we are not even thinking about all of the waste and the surplus that is generated before those clothing are being made, and all of the other millions that are being left to the sides for maybe having a sleeve a little bit longer than the other or being the wrong shade of grey. So what's going to be happening in between? You know, what are we doing? And so we go back to what you were saying, you know, looking at our clothes like the good friends they are, slowing down. Except we can slow down, but I've not yet heard one brand, and I talk to them because again, you know, with Fashion Revolution, we do talk to brands. I've not seen anyone saying, I'm investing a shitload of money in circularity, but in the meantime, while we get there, I'm going to slow down. I've just not heard that happening. So it's not enough for us to slow down. We have to look at the culture of the fashion industry right now. It's a culture of excess, of addiction, nearly. But it's basically looking at an industry that it's thriving on inefficiency and somehow on a moral, it's a little wrong, you know, we all know that we can't go on like this much longer. I mean, you know, we know about resources, we know that we need to take this thing into our own hands. So I think that there is a huge thing to be said from what we can do, especially aesthetically. I mean, you know, whether you love holes or not. Actually, we used to consider mending or visible mending a sign that we couldn't afford to buy something new. I think now we should wear it with pride as a sign that we can't afford to throw something away. We at Fashion Revolution encourage, if you go on our website, you can see all of our resources are downloadable for free. One of the funnest things that we did is that we worked with the haulers. I don't know whether you know the YouTubers, they're called haulers. They just buy, and then potentially chuck. And they have, 5, 10 million subscribers, age 9, 10. And so we did the alternative for them, where we encourage them to enjoy fashion but without spending money, actually buying nothing new, mending, swapping, and so on and so forth. And we have something like, 4 million views on that. And that was a really important step that we did to try and inform our audience that there are other ways of being in fashion. And the next thing that we did, and I'm sure that you will see it later on at the exhibition, we worked on several fanzine, and this is our fanzine, Loved Clothes Last. And I'm very proud of it because it very much contains the knowledge of years of swimming in waste. And, it feels like it's a good balance between the artisanry of what it is fashion and the physicality of loving a piece of clothing married to what technology will bring us to, what innovation in materials looks like in the future, and how potentially those two things will marry in the very near future. So very quickly, a little bit about me. So, as I said, I'm a recovering fashion designer. I had a label for many years called From Somewhere, and we were the first label to reuse pre-consumer waste at scale. We worked with a local cooperative in Italy. I reused anything from Alaya to Gucci for our collections, but this collection we did with Tesco Clothing in 2008, again at scale, reusing their stock and remnants from their factories in Sri Lanka. This was our collection with Topshop Reclaim to Wear, which again, at large scale, it sold internationally for 4.5 years. It's still going, it's now called Topshop Reclaim. And this is a collection that we did with Speedo during the Olympics, reusing all of the defected leftovers from their factories in Portugal. This was the dress. It was called the Unity dress because it actually contained all of the flags of their different swimmers. So we strategically put like China and Russia and America together, and we played a little bit with vicinity, proximity, and so on. But it's something I teach, it's something I mentor a lot of students on the concept of upcycling, and it has convinced me that there is an opportunity here that we're not seeing, and yet it's the one that many students have instinctively. They understand it. It's part of their DNA, really, to reuse what they find. This is something which I learned very definitely at Estetica, where I did start mentoring designers. I still mentor quite a few. Estetica, we had some amazing upcyclists there from, Dr. Noki, Christopher Rayburn, his career started there, and younger ones that are alive and kicking now, Katie Jones, Bethany Williams, and I urge you all to look at a very young designer who wasn't in Estetica, because by then we had closed, but who's really successful. His name is Germanier, and he launched his collection just now in Paris. And everything that he uses comes from secondhand, whether it's the fact that he uses broken Swarovski beads and vintage denim, and everything that he uses comes from a source that was here already. And this is what I would like to see in the future, is an army of young creatives that are using what is here already, because there's enough. There is enough of what we've got to keep using and reusing, to keep assembling and disassembling, to take it out of the rubbish. There is a way of changing the way that we see things so that we can stop to call it waste and we can start to think of it as a resource. And I have the pleasure of being a visiting fellow at Central St. Martin's. The reason why I wasn't here last night was because there was the show. And I'm reminded every time I see them, not just that this generation is potentially the first generation that's waking up every morning, and they actually don't know if there is going to be an inhabitable planet when they're 80. I mean, that is something that scares them, but it's also something that challenges them. And we're not looking at them at all. The reason why I feel committed to the younger generation is because, and in particular young designers, is because I feel that we've sold them a dream and we've actually delivered a nightmare. And, you know, how difficult is it these days to become a fashion designer? It's near impossible. This industry is run by giants. And somebody previously said the next big thing is going to be lots of small things. I salute you for saying that. I agree with that completely. We need to stop this concept of perpetual growth and upscaling one to the height of this thing. How about we think of upscaling maybe 20,000 to here-ish? You know, we need to change the way that we've been thinking. We need to talk about things that are collective and the strength of one being also the strength of the other, because this is what the future looks like. It is a marriage between lots and lots and lots of creatives who will be needed to somehow defy the arrival of AI and the technology that all of these creative people are also being a part in discovering. So for me, it does make sense to continue investing in amazing experimental technology, but it would also make sense to invest in things that we've got right here and right now, and perhaps we're not utilizing them because they're not fast enough, or because they're just slightly outside of the system that we've been swimming along. So, you know, just think about the factories. So 25 years ago, all factories in developing countries did not have design studios. Brands would go there, they would produce, and then the clothes would be sent. Now they all have pretty successful design studios, to the point that designers are now called buyers because they don't really need to design that much. It's already been made for them. You know, the design studios are so clever that they can anticipate what an ASOS would want, or what a Topshop would want. So that's how the system works. And so I'd like to think that maybe we will evolve into having upcycling units in some of those best factories. A new job creation, somebody say a creative waste engineer, someone that can think this surplus before it becomes waste. Someone that liaises with a whole bunch of designers who are pretty happy because, you know, look online and everything is bright and colorful. You know, what's wrong if a t-shirt only has one green sleeve and it's slightly different sleeve because you bloody found it in the warehouse? That's fine. You know, we will need to adapt our design thinking to the resources that we won't have or will have. I'm going to read you quickly from our manifesto, because I'm actually going to plug the manifesto. I'd like you all to go and find it on our website if you could. It's really lovely, and some amazing people that you'll see later have signed it. This is point number 7. Fashion never unnecessarily destroys or discards, but mindfully redesigns and recuperates in a circular way. Fashion is repaired, reused, recycled, and upcycled. Our wardrobes and landfills do not overflow with clothes that are coveted but not cherished, bought but not kept. And I stand by this, and many other people are standing by this, and we're beginning to see on our 5th year of campaigning, this was the biggest year we've ever had by far. We've had people really responding to the message, and we are encouraged by this. We are encouraged that we started a strange conversation. And, and, you know, a few years ago, people didn't really mention supply chain, collective bargaining, transparency as part of their regular lexicon. It's much more normal now. And I feel that, you know, we asked a difficult question, who made my clothes? But we asked it in a simple way, in an honest way. We asked it somehow because we tried to create empathy without pity for the people who make our clothes. And that question is being answered more and more. And as I said, this really was our biggest year so far. We've grown exponentially. And we really are the biggest fashion activism movement in the world. There were over 2,000 articles written about the revolution globally throughout the world this April. And I'm talking in newspapers that are being read by commuters in India, on the front of the China Morning Post. I mean, you know, in newspapers that are read. So we are being heard. And I urge you to keep supporting us and to keep following us and to, you know, we are going to not stop. We know that you guys care. Maybe it's just you in this room, but we know that this movement is growing, and there's been a lot of talk of fashion and food, seeing what's happening with veganism. I think that really we are beginning to understand that clothes are our chosen skin, that we can speak with what we wear, and most of all, that this fashion supply chain is not some kind of la-la land that's far away from you, because everyone's wardrobe is in the fashion supply chain. So every day when you wake up, you can do something. Every day you can be a part of the solution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ursula. You're also part of our panel, so stay here. The chairs are arriving any minute. I guess the 3 chairs we need for our future further discussion. Thanks so much, Ursula, because you really tapped into some of the things we were discussing today, like the new aesthetics, while being a whole with some garment around it, but also other important things, the comparison with food, because the interesting thing when it comes to, there the chairs are coming, the interesting thing is that food waste is approximately the same percentage. So you were discussing about 40% waste. In food, it's around the same thing, rotten food that arriving in time at the markets or arriving there are the chairs. Thanks so much. And of course, fashion revolutionary spirit was already here all day. Have a seat. And the person joining us who haven't seen yet on stage is Otto von Busch. Many things, associate professor of integrated design at the School of Design Strategies, Parsons, the New School, but also fashion artist, hacktivist, theorist, and designer. Yeah, Otto. Let's start with you, because this hacktivist part is interesting. I read an interview with you, and you said something really interesting, so let's start there. We have to critically hack the operating system of modernity and the industrial modes of production. Now, our speakers were hacking the concept of aesthetics, how we reinterpretation of aesthetics, hacking by redefining waste as a surplus, or the transparency, introducing it as a hack into the system. Are these the hacks you're thinking of? Are they the hacks by we use the flaws of the system to improve the system? Or do you also have some other strategies you would like to share with us?
Yeah, no, I mean, I started working with that hacking metaphor 15 years ago, or almost 20 years ago now. When hacking meant something else too, it wasn't really government hacking other governments and you know, those kind of things.
Oh, the good old times.
Yeah. No, but it was, you know, and of course it's still an interesting way, I think, of thinking how you insert your practice into an operating system. You know, meaning, should we, you know, can it be open source, and can we produce more participation? Can we produce more, open up an interface where people are invited to engage with what we're doing? Because it was very much about, you know, how do we break the barrier between designers and consumers and produce more lasting commitments, but also in a sense grow capabilities of people, because I think the tricky part with a lot of the fashion economy is that it's based on that we preserve, designers have the fun, and then people have to have their boring jobs, and then they come to us at the end of the month to spend their money, in a sense, you know. And also we are then needing for them to be addicted to our work, because otherwise they won't come back, you know. So we need to continuously undermine their self-esteem enough for them to come back to us, because otherwise we will be out of business. So there's a very sort of sad way of talking about empowerment, because we never really empower anyone, you know. So that was where sort of, could we think about hacking in ways that could sort of be more empowering, meaning that we could, you know, reclaim skills, or we could help people use more capabilities and widen the interface between producer and consumer. At the same time, I think what, as you know, 15 years ago, hacking meant something else. It meant more constructivist. It meant more can-do mentality. And I think today, what hacking reveals also is that hacking is a form of warfare. You know, hacking is an asymmetric type of warfare, where, you know, big players are actually manipulating different systems. You know, and I think coming back to the question of collaboration, earlier, in a sense, also every collaboration is asymmetric. We think usually that collaboration necessarily is good and is virtuous, but if you collaborate too much, you become a collaborateur, and you work with the enemy. And and those kind of things, we need to be much more clear-sighted how we actually collaborate, because I think as long as we keep reproducing a sort of a discourse where this virtuous. We fail to see the troubles that we keep pushing before us.
What I like about your opening statement is that you're exploring again this notion of language, how hacking was something else 15 years ago and it turned something new. So if you listen to Ursula and to Christina, what kind of wordings would you use? What kind of new philosophies behind this approach compared to 15 years ago, even without the comparison?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I think is central, and I'm trying to understand, is sort of how do we situate fashion and the unsustainability of fashion here? Because I think the tricky part for many too is that we push sustainability to be a discussion that concerns working conditions overseas or things like that. And we've often failed to see what are the social dynamics that actually here keeps reproducing or keeps us asking for more fashion. Why is it necessary for me to have more? Why do I feel that I need to eat more in that sense, because I'm stuck in an economy where we all compete against each other, and we are actually all drawn in to a sort of what Robert Farris calls social combat, where everybody is actually continuously in some sort of competition with each other. And fashion plays a role there. Because fashion is shallow, we judge people much easily, things that we should not really think otherwise. So we start, bullying people, and clothing becomes the interface by which we can say things we otherwise cannot say and think.
That's very interesting to start with you and maybe also the two others. How can we intervene these social dynamics? Where do you see an important intervention to challenge these social dynamics, because they are part of this reproducing system with the waste, with the current aesthetics, and not changing them?
I've been speaking too much, so
you start,
okay.
and then I'll ask
I would just say training. We need to train.
Okay.
Awareness is not enough.
Yeah.
We are all aware that sugar is bad for us, that smoking is bad for us. The last beer is always bad for me. It's like we need to train not to do these things, and that needs, and the school system is totally failing on that, because the fashion schools are continuously perpetuating a competitive environment where, collaboration, knowing each other, and sharing emotional states is not welcome. And I think that, we need to start there.
Yeah. Okay. Christine, what do you think? Where do we intervene in this social dynamics that Otto is describing, and I think correctly so?
Yeah, well, I recently read a lot about a concept called degrowth, which I find really interesting, that probably a lot of you have heard about too. But it's kind of like basically the idea that we don't always have to, we view growth and more as something positive always. What if sometimes thinking, okay, now I actually have enough? And I see, it's both within like fashion, but also many other industries, of course. But like the idea that okay, if you build up something, then you have to make it bigger, and then you have to produce more. And sometimes maybe it's fine to just keep it at when it's working and when it's sustainable and when it just can turn around and work the way it is. And also with not maybe. We can look at both designers, but also consumers as well. It's something that goes hand in hand, like the consumption of goods. Like you are saying, that we're just kind of providing, as fashion industry, people with almost like opium for the people, so that they can keep going and feel good about what they're doing, earn some money to buy that extra shirt. But actually, it doesn't feel that good. It doesn't give you a hangover like a beer does, but it does a little bit in a way.
It's a quick fix instead of something more.
It does give you kind of like a slight hangover if you consume too much. It just makes you feel not good about yourself. And this, I think, is also why we're seeing more and more the talk about, people living as nomads and selling everything and living out from a bag. And I think we're just going to see more and more people doing that kind of thing. Of course, right now it's like a first mover kind of thing, and it's not that many people that do it. But it goes hand in hand with people being able to work from wherever, with many different tendencies in our society, with maybe us being more closely connected to value-wise to people from the other side of the planet, and maybe seeking these kinds of people. So all these tendencies, I think, go hand in hand. And it's a tendency that I think we will see very much in the future, and that involves people really not consuming as much, simply because they want to be, I mean, also like now, for example, with music, I mean, I have a lot of records, vinyl, that's something I really treasure, but it's difficult to carry around, and we don't own CDs anymore. No. We don't really own books anymore. We have them on tablets.
Access,
I'm not saying that's necessarily always good, because something is also lost, tactility, friction, sense experiences. But I think we will see the same thing in fashion as well. People demanding garments that you can use for many different occasions, that can be modulated, so we don't have to own so much, so that we're free in a sense.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Rosla, what do you think? Also, when we change these social dynamics, where should we start? And, well, these new notions of more access instead of ownership, maybe also solving...
It's such a huge
thing. I know, yeah.
So it was Marx, I agree, Marx said, you know, the opium is the religion is the opium of the masses, and definitely consumerism is our crack cocaine. So it must leave us somehow depleted in one way or another. I do think it's culture. I mean, you know, actually fashion is very predictable. So it keep on cyclically, it recycles itself, you know, in looks and in, you know, we like the 60s when we're in the 80s and so on and so forth. I think the first question I was ever asked when I did Estetica by Susie Menkes, who is this well-known fashion journalist, was, but do you think that sustainable fashion is a trend? And I turned around and I said, no, absolutely not. It's fast fashion that is a trend. And this was 2006, and she thought I had, you know, really gone bonkers. But I believe it. I mean, you know, I think that we will be looking at this period of time as, you know, if we want to look at the larger context of history, you know, first of all, fashion is born exploitative. You know, cotton was picked by slaves in Africa. It was then sent to England to be woven in sweatshops by children. It was then delivered globally by the East India Company, who raped and pillaged, and, you know, so it's not an industry that has a particularly good start. The Industrial Revolution, however, is still small compared to where we will be going, and this moment in time is the triumph of greed, and there are only two ways that it can go. You know, either we wake up and say, whoa, that was wrong, let's make it better, or we're not going to have the morning to wake up in which we will have the privilege to ask ourselves that question.
But some of the speakers today also mentioned that they believe in a new generation, a younger generation, which is maybe a fertile soul, or where we talk about culture, or really are part of a culture which wants to perceive things differently. Is that something you...
So if from Socrates to you will hear how they describe the generation that's come after them. It's always, oh, these kids, they don't have respect for older people, they don't leave them to sit in public places.
But now we hear the opposite.
No, we're not in the opposite. No? We're still. All I'm saying is that it's kind of human to have both hope and at the same time, you know, being the grumpy old 50-year-old that finds the younger generation intolerable. We are very human, you know, and this is something I feel that we need to be, you know, we need to remind ourselves. But again, I'm interested in history, so I'm looking at things like the hippies, you know. There weren't so many of them, and yet they made a lot of noise. Yeah. And I think that there are many, many more of us now, so the noise can be louder. I am a positive person. I believe that the noise will be loud enough to make a difference because it will permeate in our culture. You know, we are the species that has culture, that has creation. And, you know, it's kept us alive for God how many thousands of years. I see that this moment is wrong. And, you know, we have an opportunity to put it right. But we do need to change the conversation. It's not just fashion. It's chemistry. It's economics. It's everyone. Yeah.
Christine, where do you see your fertile ground of your possibilities of having this aesthetically sustainable way of approach?
Sorry.
Yeah. So for instance, do we see it in new generations? Do you see it in the commons which we discussed earlier? Where do you see the most fertile possibilities of introducing this different aesthetics?
Well, I certainly think that it's beneficial to introduce it in education, design education. Yep. I've been really working very well with my students about this concept, and they've been really good at integrating it. I think some really interesting projects have come out of it that I could have never thought about, and that's the beauty of it. That sometimes you think about something and then other people take it further, and so I think it could be beneficially introduced there. But yeah, of course, when I speak to my students about this concept, it's also really important that we talk about how do we then communicate it? I mean, storytelling, getting it out, communicating the importance about, production time, well-made things, what it can do for you, the beauty of not owning that much, how liberating it is. The beauty of just owning a few really good products, the beauty of seeing garments as investments, just like we do with furniture or a car, which we don't really need in this kind of world that we're in right now. So, I mean, it's important that they also become good communicators and tell a story. And the fashion revolution is certainly an important part of that as well. But I think the attitude change has to go hand in hand with kind of design-driven sustainability and also consumer culture. I mean, it has to just happen on both sides. And it's a matter of, I think, as soon as consumers have experienced the liberating and the beauty of just owning a few things that just work for you every time, I think they will do it again. So it's also a matter of really communicating and making people understand how important it is to buy something that is well made, that is ethically produced, and how liberating it is to just own very few things.
Okay.
Immaterialism. Yes.
Immaterialism. Also, last but not least, we're shifting, or you see many companies, not only in fashion industry, but less product focus and more about the purpose. Why are we here as a human being, as a company, as an industry? And the interesting thing about fashion, of course, that it can bring such a strong identity in coloring this purpose. How do you see the fashion industry being part of that kind of looking to a new way of defining yourself as a business or as an individual, or is it something you are not strongly believing in yourself?
I mean, a student to me highlighted something when she said, isn't the problem with fashion or unsustainable fashion that it's poor people buying fashion? And I think it's sort of highlighted to how much of the discourse is happening today, that we blame the poor for the working conditions of the poor overseas, and when we blame their ambitions and how they address their ambitions in what we call fast fashion, but what is not called fast fashion when it's haute couture, even though it's the sort of the circulation of the garments is as quick. So it's very easy to be, to be sustainable, and the way we often think about, keeping aesthetic values, or just keeping things longer, is also this idea that, well, I have a sort of an identity, if you want to say so, that is worth preserving. Exactly. I want my children to inherit my garments. Oh yes, if I own a castle, they can inherit my Rolls Royce, my Jaguar, my castle, but I don't want them to inherit my sleeping bag if I'm homeless, or my poverty. So how do we get sustainability to the sustainability discussion around fashion to work for the poor who need fashion for the sort of the class journey, or even the social mobility, for the job interviews, for the way that they're flirting, the ways that they want us to connect to people? Because I think we take it almost sort of for granted that we can ask for people to want to be themselves longer, whereas fashion is so much a tool for this transformation of hope, in a sense. So how do we sort of preserve that mobility or that possibility of fashion while still making it sustainable? And what parts need to be circular then? Because I think the tricky part there is that sustainability is not equally distributed. People definitely need very different types of sustainability depending on where you are in the world and in society. Yes, if you're a lord in England, that's fine, but if you are moving in China from the countryside and wants to sort of make a career, of course, that's another need, another way of doing and being. So there's also, coming back to being, that, there's there's a distribution, an unequal distribution of being, meaning that it is easier to be yourself if you're rich and if you're having possibilities and a cultural world that is enriching, whereas it's harder to be a rich life if you are in the poverty and needs to sort of use fashion to actually grow a sensibility of sociality in that sense.
Thanks. Otto, Christine, Ursula, thanks so much for your discussion. You may go off stage because I want to say, Otto, thanks so much for more questions, but luckily we have one more day to discuss these things, and we'll do so in all these different angles. For now, listen very carefully what I will say now about us moving to the next location for the opening of the State of Fashion. Because maybe it doesn't look like it's raining outside, but if it's raining outside, there are umbrellas. For the people who are physically challenged where the location is too far from this location, there are buses shifting from the location, also going back later on. So if you need a bus, please go outside and pick the bus you need because the location is too far. There are volunteers outside to guide you through the location. So if we can move as soon as possible from this location to the back doors to the next location, we will be on time for the opening. Two more things. To actually access the opening, you need your wrist, your collar wrist. It's in the bag. If it's not in the bag, please go to one of the volunteers and make sure that you get one. And you need your signage for tomorrow. So don't lose it, because accessing it tomorrow, you will need your key cord, that's the name for it. So let's go to the opening of State of Fashion with the Minister. Have fun and good luck tomorrow. Thank you.